The auction yard stank of sweat and dust, and the boards beneath her bare feet burned in the sun. Josie Larrabee stood on that makeshift platform while the crowd leaned in, close voices, low eyes, weighing her like stock. Her step-uncle slouched nearby, whiskey on his breath, waiting to trade her for silver. She didn't speak until the bidding began, and then it was only to tell them not to buy her if they meant to sell her again. The men laughed, all but one, a tall figure leaning in the shade outside the saloon, his hat brim pulled low. He stepped forward through the heat boots, whispering over the dirt, and the air seemed to hold its breath. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever faced a choice that could change the rest of your life. My name's Josie Larrabee, and before that day in Cold Creek, I'd known little but the slow work of a homestead. I was born east of the mountains, raised on ground. My father cleared himself where every acre was fenced by hand, and every winter was met with a full root cellar. We lived by the Sabbath, by neighborly duty, and by the belief that a man's word was worth more than his coin. Mother kept the home running smooth as a well-oiled stove, and father taught me to tend chickens, mend harness leather, and keep the accounts in a neat ledger. We didn't have much, but we never lacked for decency. When the wagon accident took them both last winter, I went to live with Earl Wainwright, my mother's half-brother. His home sat closer to town, where the dust carried the smell of whiskey from the saloons, and the sound of the freight trains echoed off the hills. Earl had none of father's steady habits. He played cards late into the night, kept bottles under the sink, and talked more about luck than work. I tried to keep the place in order, but every time I opened a drawer or cupboard, I found another debt notice folded in greasy paper. By midsummer, the heat lay heavy on the land, the hens had stopped laying, and Earl was gone most days, chasing some scheme. When he came back one afternoon with two strangers in trail-stained coats, I knew trouble had finally reached our door. They spoke in low voices on the porch, and though I couldn't make out every word, I caught enough talk of payment of something worth more than the cattle. My stomach turned cold even in that July heat. Earl told me to put on my dress and come with him into town. He didn't say why, and I didn't ask, but the way he wouldn't meet my eyes told me plenty. The ride into Cold Creek was long and dry. We passed shuttered stores and porches with empty chairs, the silver boom's riches long gone. At the yard by the livery, men were already gathering hats, tipped-back coin pouches in hand. Earl led me to a rough-built platform, and the smell of manure and hot pine boards filled my nose. The auctioneer slapped the post beside me and called for bids, his voice rising over the flies. That was when I saw him. The man in the shade, watching without a smirk or a leer, his stance still but ready. I didn't know his name then, only that his eyes didn't treat me like a prize to be claimed. And when the first silver hit the auctioneer's palm, I knew something was about to happen that would change the trail I'd been forced to walk. The bidding moved in short jumps, a handful of coins at a time, each offer tossed out like it was a game. I kept my eyes low, the dust beneath my feet blurring in the heat. Franklin Boyd's voice rang out over the others, followed by a laugh from Roy Hanlon somewhere near the back. I'd heard them both at the yard before, men who spent more time leaning on fence rails than earning an honest day's wage. Through the murmur of offers, I caught the sound of boots drawing closer, steady measured steps that didn't match the restless shuffling of the crowd. The man from the shade, the one who hadn't looked at me like a prize, pushed through the onlookers. He wore a long trail-stained coat, the collar turned up against the sun, and his limp was more noticeable the closer he came. Without a word, he reached inside, pulled out a worn leather pouch, and poured its contents into the auctioneer's hand. The silver didn't look like much, but the weight of it filled the man's palm. The auctioneer started to protest, eyeing Franklin, as if expecting him to go higher, but the stranger stepped forward half a pace. No one else spoke. The auctioneer closed his fist, nodded once, and that was it. I stepped down from the platform, the boards creaking under my bare feet. No one reached for my arm. No one dragged me through the crowd. Franklin called something after me about the stranger being too poor to feed me, but I kept walking. The man who'd just spent his last silver was already heading toward the edge of town, his long stride unbroken despite the limp. I caught up just before we reached the last building. "Why'd you do it?" I asked. He didn't turn his head. I tried again. "You going to keep me?" "No," he said, voice dry as the dust underfoot. I stopped for half a step before asking, "Then what am I supposed to do?" He looked at me, then gray eyes dulled by years of hard miles, but not empty. "Just once," he said, "do what you want. I just didn't want to see you sold again." He kept walking and I followed. The road west out of Cold Creek stretched flat and open, the sun beating down without mercy. Fence posts leaned in the heat, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots in the dirt. I stayed a few steps behind every stone and thorn biting into my bare feet. He didn't look back. Didn't slow for me, but didn't try to leave me behind either. By the time the sun dropped toward the hills, the skin on my heels had split, and each step sent a dull throb up my legs. The wind picked up, tugging at the torn neckline of my dress. I kept pulling it up with one hand, head bent against the grit in the air. When he finally spoke, his voice came rough from disuse. "About a mile more. There's water." The mile stretched on, but at last we reached a split-rail fence with a gate hanging on one hinge. The cabin beyond was squat and weathered, its roof sagging in the middle, a small stack of cut wood leaning against the side. A chicken coop tilted in the yard, covered partly by a sheet of old canvas. He opened the gate and stepped through, pausing to look back at me. "You coming?" At the pump near the porch, he worked the handle until a stream of water gurgled into the trough. "Drink," he said, tipping his head toward it. I dropped to my knees and cupped my hands under the flow. The water was warm but clean, the taste easing something tight in my chest. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and oil. One bed, one table, a single chair, and a shelf with tin plates. A rifle leaned in the corner near the door. He set his bedroll beside it and nodded toward the bed. "You can take that. Blanket's clean. I'll stay here." He ladled beans into 2 bowls, sliding one across the table toward me. "Not much, but it's hot." I ate slowly, watching the way he moved, careful, deliberate, like a man used to quiet. When I asked again why he'd done it, he kept his gaze on the stove. "I saw the way they looked at you." We said little else. After he rinsed the dishes at the pump, he sat near the door, back against the wall, boots still on. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, the day's heat still clinging to the walls. When I woke in the night, he hadn't moved the rifle within easy reach. The next morning, pale light crept through the warped boards. The blanket was tucked around me neatly, though I didn't remember doing it. I found him outside, sleeves rolled to the elbow, setting a pot of coffee on the stove. "Chickens need feeding," he said, nodding toward the yard. I scattered corn from a bucket while he stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching without comment. Inside, he pointed to a basket under the table. "There's thread and a needle if you want to fix that dress." I stitched the torn neckline as he mended a section of fence, the sound of the hammer carrying through the open door. Later, he set 2 eggs on the stove, giving me the larger portion without a word. Over supper, he told me he'd once worked outside Independence before the war, and that his sister's name was Ellie. When I asked if she was gone, he didn't answer, just fetched a folded shawl from a chest and laid it on the back of my chair. "You'll need this tonight. It's cold." By the end of that day, I knew little more about him than I had at the start. But the silence between us had shifted. It no longer felt like the space between strangers. And as the last light faded beyond the ridge, a distant rhythm began to rise from the east road, the steady beat of approaching hooves. The hoofbeats carried closer, the sound steady on the packed dirt. I stepped out onto the porch, The shawl Clint had given me pulled tight around my shoulders. He was already there, one hand resting on the post, the other hanging loose at his side. 2 riders came into view along the east road. Even at a distance I knew them. Franklin Boyd in his dust-colored coat, Roy Hanlon just behind Hat, tipped back like he owned the trail. They pulled up short at the gate horses blowing from the ride. Franklin's grin didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't think you'd take her clear out here," he called. "Most folks figured you just threw your money away." Clint didn't answer, only watched them from where he stood. Roy leaned forward on his saddle horn. "Thing is, there's folks in town saying she wasn't bought proper. No papers means she's still someone's property. That's the law." I felt the cold in my hands despite the heat. "They sold me like cattle," I said, before Clint could speak. "You really want to talk about law?" Roy spat into the dirt. "We're not talking about feelings, girl. We're talking about what's owed." Clint's voice came even. "There's no law in Cold Creek, just men pretending to be one." Franklin's smirk faded a little. Roy shifted in his saddle, eyes narrowing. "So, that's how it's going to be." Clint's hand rested against the post. "You're not taking her. Not now. Not ever." The 2 men lingered another moment, then wheeled their horses and headed back the way they'd come. Dust hung in the air long after they'd gone. That night, Clint bolted the door. He sat by the fire with the rifle across his lap, while I lay on the bed, staring at the low ceiling. The flicker of lantern light threw shadows against the walls. "Did you know they'd come?" I asked into the quiet. He didn't look over. "I figured someone might." I turned to face him. "Why didn't you leave me in town?" He set his gaze on the fire. I didn't like what I saw in their eyes. Didn't want to carry that weight again. My voice came low. "I don't want to be a burden here." His answer was quick. "You're not." I searched his face. "Then what am I?" He met my eyes. "Someone I'm choosing to keep safe." The next morning broke clear and cool. I found Clint outside working a fence post back into place. He favored his left leg more than usual, each shift of weight deliberate. "You should let me do that," I said from the gate. He didn't look up. "I can finish it." I walked over. "You don't have to finish everything alone." After a pause, he stepped back and handed me the shovel. The soil was dry and hard, and the work pulled at the muscles in my arms, but the rhythm steadied me. When I finished, Clint had gone inside. I found him seated at the table, a folded sheet of paper in front of him, its edges smudged from rough handling. "They left this by the gate," he said. I picked it up and read the crude handwriting aloud. "Property retrieval to be discussed. No sheriff out here. Might as well make it clean. You got 2 days." My throat felt tight. "It's a warning." Clint nodded. "Not a bluff. What are you going to do?" I asked. He looked up. "What we're going to do is stay calm." I folded my arms. "They won't ask twice." His voice stayed even. I know. The room fell quiet, but for the pop of the fire in the stove. I took a step closer. "I don't want to run." His eyes met mine. "I wouldn't let you. Not alone." I held his gaze. "Then teach me." He leaned back slightly. "Teach you what to shoot." For a long moment he said nothing, then gave a single nod. We went behind the barn that afternoon. He set up tin cans on the fence rail, then showed me how to hold the rifle, the stock firm against my shoulder. The weight surprised me heavier than I'd expected. "Don't pull the trigger," he said, standing just behind me. "Press it slow." The recoil stung my shoulder on the first shot, and the can stayed put. On the second, the shot went wide. By the 4th try, the tin spun off the rail and landed in the dust. I lowered the rifle, a faint ache in my arms, but my grip stayed steady. Clint nodded once. Yeah, you can do it. We sat in the dirt afterward, the barn wall at our backs, the air still warm from the day. You think they'll come tomorrow? I asked. Probably. I glanced at him. Do you think I'm worth this trouble? He looked toward the horizon. I didn't do this because I waited out. I did it because I couldn't walk away again. That night we ate stew left from the day before. When I saw the strain in his face as he shifted his leg, I brought the bandage roll from the shelf. Let me wrap it, I said. He didn't argue. The scar was ragged, the skin around it marked by years of healing gone wrong. I worked carefully, the cloth smoothing under my hands. When I tied it off and leaned back, his hand came up brushing a loose strand of hair from my face. My voice was quiet. I want to stay. He held my gaze. You already are. For the first time since I'd followed him from Cold Creek, he laid his bedroll a few feet from mine instead of by the door. He still kept the rifle close, but his eyes closed sooner, and the silence between us held something new. By morning, the air was heavier, the kind that promised something was coming. The morning felt thick, the light dimmer than usual, as though the air itself was waiting for something to happen. I rose before Clint, pulling on the blue dress he'd found for me in the barn. The fabric was soft from wear, and the repaired seams held steady under my fingers. When I stepped outside, Clint was stacking kindling against the wall, his coat already on, and the rifle propped within easy reach. They'll come, I said from the doorway. He glanced over his shoulder and gave a single nod. They will. My hands tightened around the shawl draped across my arms. I want to be the one to answer if they call. He straightened eyes, narrowing slightly. You sure I met his gaze? They think I'm something that can be traded back and forth. I want them to see I'm not. Clint studied me for a moment longer before nodding once. All right. The rest of the morning passed with few words. I swept the porch, the bristles scraping against the boards, while Clint moved tools into the shed. Every so often my eyes drifted toward the east road, half expecting to see dust rising from a pair of riders. Nothing yet. By midday the sound came hoofbeats again, steady and unhurried. I stepped off the porch before Clint did the rifle balanced in my hands. It wasn't raised, but it wasn't hidden either. Franklin and Roy drew up 10 yards from the fence, the Mervs, their horses pawing at the dirt. Franklin's voice carried easily. We gave you 2 days. You know why we're here. My grip on the rifle tightened. You're here to take something you don't own. Roy leaned forward. Girl, you were bought. A man signed for you. This fellow throwing coin doesn't change that. I raised the rifle a fraction enough to make the motion clear. I'm not a parcel. I'm not stock. I walked away from that platform under my own will, and no one owns me. Roy's tone sharpened. That's not how it works. Clint stepped out then, not in front of me, but beside me. Then you're in the wrong place. The men traded a glance, Franklin's mouth tightening. This isn't finished, he said. I kept my voice even. Then finish it. The rifle stayed steady in my hands, the sun at my back. They didn't draw. Instead, Franklin spat in the dust, turned his horse, and they both rode off without looking behind. I didn't lower the rifle until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did my knees feel the strain of standing so still. I sat on the porch, elbows on my thighs, breathing deep. Clint stayed beside me, his eyes on the road. When my breath finally evened, I asked quietly, You think they'll come again? Not if they've got sense, he said. Then after a pause, But if they do, we'll be ready. The rest of the day we worked side by side in the yard. Clint mended a loose section of fence and I cleared weeds from the garden plot. Neither of us spoke much, but the silence no longer felt uncertain. By the time the sun dipped low, I was sore in the shoulders and hands, but the ground between the rows was clean and the fence line stood straight again. After supper, Clint sat at the table sharpening a small knife while I folded the shawl over the back of a chair. The light from the lantern softened the edges of the room, catching the lines in his face. I rested my hands on the table. I wasn't sure I could hold steady with that rifle. He set the knife down. "You did?" I searched his expression. I was ready to use it. He gave a slow nod. "I know." The fire in the stove burned low, and the room grew quiet again. I felt the weight of the day settle in my chest, not heavy, but solid. We'd stood our ground together, and that was something I hadn't known I could do until now. The wind shifted outside, brushing against the walls like a low breath. Somewhere in the distance, a single hoofbeat echoed, then faded. I glanced toward the door, but Clint hadn't moved from his chair. His eyes, though, were fixed on the dark beyond the porch, as if he'd heard something I hadn't. By the time the sun rose over the ridge the next morning, the weight of what had happened at the gate the day before was still heavy in my chest. Clint was already up, hauling in a stack of split wood, while the breath of dawn still hung in the air. I stepped outside, boots scuffing the porch, and saw the rifle leaning in the same spot it had been the night before. "They'll try again," I said, watching the frost burn off the grass. Clint set the wood down by the wall. "Then we'll be ready." I pulled my shawl tighter. "Ready isn't enough. I want to know how to stand my ground without you having to step in for me." His eyes settled on me, quiet but steady. "You want to learn?" I nodded. "Teach me." After a moment, he gave one slow nod. "All right." Behind the barn, he set up tin cans on the top rail of the fence. The wood was sun-bleached, the air sharp with the smell of hay and old leather. He handed me the rifle, the weight of it settling heavy in my hands. "First thing, keep it tight to your shoulder," he said, adjusting my grip. "Don't pull the trigger. Press it slow." The first shot kicked hard and went wide. The second found the rail, but not the can. Clint stood beside me, his voice low and even, pointing out where my sight had drifted. On the fourth try, the can jumped from the fence and dropped into the dust. My breath came quick, but my hands were steady. Clint gave a small nod. "That's it." We reloaded and worked through the row until each can lay in the dirt. My shoulder ached, but the stiffness in my spine had eased. When we finished, we sat in the shade of the barn wall, knees drawn up the dry grass, whispering in the wind. "You think they'll ride in today?" I asked. "Hard to say," Clint replied, watching the line of hills. "Could be today, could be next week." After the midday meal, I found him at the table, his legs stretched out stiff beneath the chair. I set the bandage roll beside him. "Let me wrap it." He didn't argue. I knelt, easing the fabric back and working the cloth around the jagged scar. The skin was marked by years of old pain, but he didn't flinch under my touch. When I tied the end, he reached up, brushed a strand of hair from my cheek, and left his hand there a moment. By late afternoon, I was back in the garden, pulling what was left of the weeds between the rows. The earth clung under my nails, the smell of it strong in the cooler air. Clint was mending the chicken coop when I heard the faint, uneven thump of a hoof striking rock. I stood brushing dirt from my hands. Clint stepped from the coop, meeting my eyes. "Rider," he said, and we both looked toward the east road. A single horse moved along the trail, the rider keeping an easy pace. The low sun glinted off something tied to the saddle. As they drew closer, I saw it was a folded piece of paper, weighted by a small stone hanging just inside the gate. The rider didn't stop. He dropped the message, touched his hat, and kept on westward without a word. Clint took the paper, broke the fold, and read it in silence before handing it to me. 2 days. Return the property or it gets settled another way. I folded the note slowly, the grit of the paper rough under my fingers. "So they're not finished." Clint's voice was even. "No. And now we know how long we have." We spent the rest of the evening checking the locks, moving tools inside, and setting a lantern in each room. The fire in the stove burned steady as night fell, but my mind was already on the morning. This time, if Franklin and Roy came, I wouldn't be the one standing in the shadow. The next morning carried the same unsettled stillness, as if the air itself had decided to wait. Clint was already at the table, a mug of coffee beside him, and the rifle laid across his knees. I poured myself a cup and joined him without speaking. Outside the frost was gone, but the ground still held the pale look of winter. By mid-morning we heard it, the distant sound of hooves rolling low across the ground. This time there was no slow build, no chance to wonder. They came in plain sight, Franklin and Roy riding hard enough to raise a trail of dust behind them. I stepped onto the porch with the rifle in hand. Clint stood just inside the door where the shadow cut across his face. The riders stopped short of the gate. Franklin called out, "We're not here to talk circles. You've had your time." I set the rifle against my shoulder, not aimed, but ready. "Then you've had your answer," I said. Roy's tone sharpened. "You're making this harder than it has to be. Come back to town, and it'll go easy." Clint stepped forward, then his boots striking the boards under me. "She's not going anywhere with you." Franklin leaned forward in his saddle. "You think you can stop us?" Clint's voice stayed level. "Yes." The silence that followed was short but hard. They didn't dismount, and they didn't try to press through the gate. Franklin finally pulled his reins, turning his horse, without another word. Roy followed, but not before giving me a look I knew meant trouble wasn't finished. When they were gone, Clint let out a long breath and glanced toward the ridge. "They're not done," he said. I kept my eyes on the road. "Then neither am I." We spent the rest of the day making the place tighter. Clint had me move a bucket of water near the porch and another inside the door. He checked the hinges on the shutters while I walked the fence line, watching for breaks. The air stayed cold enough that every breath seemed louder than it ought to. In the afternoon, Clint called me over to the pump. "Show me again," he said, handing me the rifle. I set my feet like he'd shown me, sighted along the barrel, and pressed the trigger slow. The tin can on the rail clattered into the dust. He nodded once, took the rifle, and set it back in its place. Inside, the light was fading, the lantern giving the room a warm glow. We sat at the table stew, cooling in our bowls. Clint finally spoke. "If they come after dark, they'll come quiet. You hear anything you can't place, wake me." I nodded, the words sitting heavy, but steady in my chest. Night brought no sound at first. The fire in the stove sank low, and the wind picked up against the walls. I woke once to hear Clint shift near the door, his hand brushing the rifle's stock. His eyes met mine in the dim light. And I saw no fear there, only a readiness I had started to understand. Near dawn, the quiet broke. A single hoofbeat, slow and deliberate, sounded beyond the fence. Clint rose without a word, moving to the window. The pale light showed a lone rider waiting on the east road. I couldn't see his face, only the shape of his hat and the dark outline of a coat. Clint set the rifle in my hands. "Stay here," he said. He stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. The rider didn't move as Clint crossed the yard to the gate. They spoke low enough that I couldn't make out the words. When Clint came back, his jaw was set tighter than before. "What was it?" I asked. He closed the door behind him. "Message from someone who wants this settled soon." I waited, but he didn't say more, only set the rifle back on its rest and began pulling on his coat. Whatever the message was, it had changed something. The rider who'd come at dawn hadn't stayed long, but his message hung between us the rest of the day like a low cloud. Clint didn't share the words yet. The way he moved told me enough. He worked with a steady urgency, checking the tack twice over, oiling the rifle, and walking the fence line again before noon. We kept to the chores in silence. My hands worked the pump, filling buckets until the handles bit into my palms. Clint carried them to the porch without speaking. setting them where they'd be close if trouble came. The cold breeze shifted now and again, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere beyond the ridge. In the afternoon, a wagon rattled up the road from town. It was Sheriff Amos Keller, a square-shouldered man in his 50s who'd been in these parts near as long as anyone could remember. He reined in at the gate and tipped his hat. "Heard there's talk of folks aiming to settle a score out here," he said. Clint stepped down from the porch. "Talk's cheap, Sheriff." "But they've been riding close." The sheriff's gaze moved to me, and I kept my eyes on his boots. "Miss Larrabee, you got somewhere else you can stay a while?" I shook my head. "Nowhere safer than here." The sheriff sighed through his nose. "I'll be in town if it turns. Wire me quick if you need a badge out here." He touched the brim of his hat again, then turned the wagon back toward the road. Dust hung in his wake long after the sound faded. That night, Clint kept the lantern burning low. I lay awake longer than I meant to, my ears pulling in every creak of the boards and whisper of the wind against the shutters. Somewhere past midnight, a horse snorted close by. Clint's shadow moved near the door, rifle in hand. We waited until the sound faded. The next morning, tracks showed fresh in the dirt near the fence. They didn't circle the house, but they were closer than the gate. Clint crouched to study them, his fingers brushing the ground. 2 riders. One with a shod horse, one without. His voice was quiet. We spent the day inside more than out, keeping the doors barred. In the afternoon, Clint went to the barn for feed, and I followed with a pail of water. The smell of hay was sharp in the cool air, the boards groaning under our steps. From the far side, a voice carried in low, muffled, "Too close." Clint froze, then eased to the barn door. Through the crack, we saw Franklin and Roy at the fence talking to a man I didn't know. Tall, narrow-faced, with a dark coat and a scar cutting across his jaw. He looked past them toward the house, then back to Franklin. Whatever they were planning, it was set between them without a word reaching us. They didn't come closer, only rode off toward the south trail. Clint turned from the door, his jaw tight. That man's no local. Could be the one sending messages. We carried the water inside without speaking of it further. By sundown, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters hard enough to cover other sounds. Clint checked each latch while I lit the lamp. The flame's glow made the room feel smaller, and the smell of burning oil clung to the air. When darkness settled in, Clint stood at the window watching the road. "If they come tonight, it won't be for talk," he said. I sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. The weight of waiting pressed heavier than the hours before. Near midnight, the dogs in the distance began barking. Clint moved to the door, and I followed. We stood in the quiet after the barking stopped, listening. Then came it a single knock on the door, slow and deliberate. Clint's hand found the rifle, and mine gripped the edge of the table. He opened the door to find no one there, only the dark yard and the faint outline of a paper tacked to the frame. He pulled it free and shut the door before the cold could follow. The note was brief, written in a hard, slanted hand. "Tomorrow, we finish this." Clint set it down on the table, his eyes meeting mine in the lamplight. "Be ready at first light," he said. The morning came sharp and cold, the kind of air that stings your lungs when you breathe too deep. Clint was already outside when I stepped onto the porch, the note from last night folded in his pocket. The sun hadn't yet cleared the ridge, and the frost still clung to the grass. We didn't have to wait long. 3 riders appeared on the south trail, moving slow, their horses blowing steam into the cold air. Franklin and Roy rode in front, the scar-jawed stranger a step behind. They reined up just short of the fence, eyes fixed on the house. Clint walked out to meet them, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. I stayed at the porch rail, close enough to hear, but far enough to keep the high ground. The scar-jawed man leaned forward in his saddle. "We're here to settle what should have been settled weeks ago," he said. The sheriff's voice cut in before Clint could answer. Amos Keller stepped from behind the barn, shotgun in hand, his badge catching the early light. "And I'm here to see it's settled by the law." The rider's stiffened eyes shifting between him and Clint. Amos didn't raise his voice, but every word carried. "I've got a signed statement, witnesses, and the circuit judge in town. You three ride out now, and you'll answer for it proper. Or you can push this here and find yourselves in the ground." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Franklin spat into the dirt, muttered something low, and turned his horse. Roy followed, though slower, throwing one last glare toward me. The stranger lingered a beat, then wheeled his horse and went after them. When the dust settled, Amos lowered his shotgun. "You'll still have to come to town tomorrow, but for now you're clear." He tipped his hat and walked back to his horse. Clint watched them ride off until they were specks on the horizon. Back inside, the quiet felt different. Not the tight, waiting silence of the past days, but the soft kind that lets you breathe again. I poured coffee while Clint set his rifle aside. "It's over," he said, though we both knew some shadows take time to fade. That evening, we stood on the porch and watched the sun sink low, spilling gold across the fields. The land looked the same as it had before, but it felt earned now, like a place we'd both fought to keep. Life on the frontier doesn't hand out easy days, but when you've stood your ground, seen the wrongs faced, and still have a roof and a friend beside you, that's a kind of wealth no man can take. If you've ever found your own way through a hard season, you know the value of that quiet at the end. Hold on to it, and maybe share this story with someone who needs to hear it.